a professor of international finance from SKEMA Business School in France, professor at CFVG Vietnam, doctor on international finance, Michel-Henry Bouchet.
Hello everyone, and you are watching Sharing Vietnam, a 15-minute talk show with the foreigners every day at 8:30 p.m. on NetViet VTC10. And let's say hello to the guest of our program today. Hello Mr. Bouchet, and thank you so much for taking your time and joining our talk show today.
Xin chào, good evening.
You can speak a little bit Vietnamese.
Very little. I try to do my best.
So it means that you traveled to Vietnam somehow, or you discovered about this country a little bit?
Yes, in fact, I've been traveling to Vietnam since the mid-1990s. In fact, initially as a World Bank senior economist, and then as chairman of Owen Stanley Financial, and today at the invitation of CFVG and l'Espace français.
So can you share with us more about your impression about the country, the people, and especially the financial situations in Vietnam?
Well, it's a fascinating country because, you know, the more you know it, the more you discover new faces of Vietnam. It's an ever-changing country. I remember in the 1990s, of course, you know, in Ho Chi Minh and Hanoi, people were always walking or biking. You know, now they moved to motorcycles, to cars. But of course, this might hide another Vietnam, you know, in the countryside. Definitely, the market economy is booming, and it is very impressive for a European. As you know, Europe is in the midst of a major crisis, and we don't have any growth, whereas Vietnam has basically a 6-7% annual GDP increase.
So can you tell us more about your decision to become one of the professors of CFVG Vietnam?
I've been a banker for the last 30 years. Now I'm the head of an investment fund in Norway, in Europe, and I try to teach what I do. I'm a doer, a practitioner, if you will, and I try to show my students basically how the world economy is doing.
Can you explain more about the conference of today you will conduct in Vietnam with the Vietnamese student?
Well, the title is the risk and opportunities of globalization, and I think it's good for the students and for everyone, in fact, to know that there has been a major shift in the global economy in the 1980s. The so-called market economy has become worldwide, and many countries which were not in the market economy have joined it. Vietnam, the Soviet Union, of course, Myanmar, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, you know, including sectors which were not in the market economy. For example, education, for example, culture, health, are now in the market economy with a two-pronged focus on competition and profit. For example, a business school, you know, has to compete with many other competitors.
In the period of globalization, a big economic crisis can become globally affected. The crisis started in the United States in 2008 instead of the European Union. However, the crisis has quickly affected the European Union severely since 2010, which made a big impact on trade and investment from the European Union to emerging countries in the world. If a developing country possesses a quick banking and finance system, the government tends to support the system by bumping cash or refinance. Because of that, the government can face the problem of budget deficit. The analysis on the changes of global economic structure and the response of Vietnam to the global crisis were the main theme of the conference, named Globalization and Financial Crisis, Challenges for the Countries. The conference was conducted by Dr. Michel-Henry Bouchet.
On the brochure of this conference, it is said that this is the very first crisis since the globalization started. So what do you think about this?
It is the first globalized financial crisis, basically because globalization has emerged only in the 1980s. You might say that the Asian crisis in 1997 has been globalized. It hit, not only Asia, but Latin America and Eastern Europe, but not very much the developed country. And in fact, this crisis has emerged in the US. It has migrated in Europe. And of course, due to trade and financial interactions, it is impacted on the developing countries, including Vietnam.
What about the impacts of this very first crisis on the Vietnamese economy?
Well, it has been, in fact, twofold. I mean, number one, in terms of trade flows, the cut in the growth in Europe has had an impact on trade flows in Vietnam. And in 2009, there's been a major cut in exports, in fact. The trade deficit has increased, and the balance of payments deficit has also increased. And you had also a slight decrease in FDI, in foreign direct investment.
What are your assessment on the response of Vietnam to the very new situation of the crisis, and about what do you think about the measure that Vietnam take at this moment in order to tackle with the crisis?
The situation back in 2009 and 2010 was serious. There was an economic overheating in Vietnam, very high, unsustainable growth rate, leading to inflation and a substantial trade deficit. But the SBV is one of the most respected central banks in the world, at least in my opinion. And the governor of the SBV has taken action, including the well-known resolution number 11, last year, which in fact attacked the roots of the crisis, mainly growth of the credit. So inflation is now, I think, is now under control. It's still high, still too high, but I think it's under control.
What do you think about the current situation of the finance and banking system in Vietnam? Because in order to tackle and stay sustainably development in the future, we need to have a very strong system.
You're absolutely right. Any banking system, which increases lending at a pace of 30% per year is leading to disaster in the US, in France, and in Vietnam. In fact, the very large increase in credit led to substantial increase in so-called NPLs, non-performing loans. The portfolio, if you will, of the banks has deteriorated, in fact. And there is here a matter of transparency. I think we need to get the right numbers. It's difficult to assess how large are these NPLs, the health of the portfolio of the banks in Vietnam. Probably not very good. So there is a need, to strengthen the banks, to improve the health of the portfolio, to screen credit more tightly, and last but not least, to increase the capitalization in the bank's portfolio, so-called capital adequacy guidelines. All the banks in the world are competing to meet the so-called Basel II regulations, which basically aim at increasing capital to 8% of the assets, absolutely indispensable.
In June 2011, IMF cited Vietnam as a country which overcame the global crisis in 2010 successfully, with GDP growth up to 6.75%. However, the crisis still continues in the European Union, and it is said that it will take quite a long time for the European Union to recover. Therefore, Vietnam's export to this market will be affected continuously. Vietnam needs to aim to produce more value-added products. In the future, Vietnam not only can take advantages of its cheap and young human resources, but also need to invest into training high-quality human resources and research and development.
So in the future, what will be the challenge to a developing country like Vietnam with the globalization and the aftermath of the crisis?
There are two kinds of challenges. Those who basically belong to any country in the globalized economy, which means stabilizing inflation, stabilizing the exchange rate, to be competitive, and so on and so forth. But Vietnam is in the particular situation. 96 million people, young population, and an emerging market country competing with 150 other countries. And then the challenges are much more specific. I think there are 2 or 3 challenges. The first one is probably to improve productivity in Vietnam. Vietnam can no longer rely on the cheap labor cost, and low value added export. It has to move up, in the value chain, which means an increase in productivity. And that means, education, training, in fact, what CFVG is doing after all, Number 2, I think the wealth gap. And the third one, which is a precondition to transform economic growth into development, is improving governance, transparency.
So in the future, especially for the young people of Vietnam, what they should know and learn, and as you have just mentioned, what can we do in order to have a strong and high quality human resources?
Well, basically 2 things, which in fact are well known by your governments. Number 1, improving higher education and training in order to match the supply and the demand in the labor market. And number 2, improving the so-called R&D, research and development, in order to improve the productivity of Vietnam's economy.
So can you explain more about R&D, research and development?
Well, basically, it's how much private companies and the public sector invest in high and new technologies, the so-called NTICs, the new technologies of information and communication. And this is basically the name of the game today. To compete in the global markets, Vietnam can no longer rely on the old system, of the cheap labor cost, mainly textiles and footwear. That worked very well in the 1990s, but today it has to shift to a new pattern, to a new system, of higher value-added products. And this, in fact, means basically improving the so-called human capital.
So what about your plan with Vietnam? Maybe in the future you may move to Vietnam and base here and continue to have Vietnam to bring the education system into a higher level?
Well, I hope that l'Espace français and CFVG will keep inviting me to hold conferences, here. It will be a pleasure. But also our fund in Norway, the North Sea Global Equity Management Fund, is looking very seriously at Vietnam. We cannot ignore Vietnam. Vietnam has defied the skeptics, as I said. And many people said that Vietnam would fall into hyperinflation, maybe social destabilization. No, in fact, again, the government woke up at the right time, and definitely will see the economy as stabilized. So we are extremely positive on Vietnam's future.
Once again, thank you so much for taking your time and joining our talk show today, and we hope to see you again in a short future in order to learn more from your conference in Vietnam.
Come on, thank you very much.
Thank you so much once again.
I appreciate it.
Thank you so much once again for your watching today, and if you have any question or recommendation for us, please don't hesitate to send us an email at sharingvietnam@gmail.com. Thank you so much and see you next time.
Xin được cảm ơn ông Michel-Henry Bouchet và biên tập viên Minh Ngân. Tiếp theo chương trình